In life, you'll hear many voices calling for you to believe their version of what's happening in the world. And I'm speaking of voices in the community around you, not necessarily voices in your head. I mean, if you have voices calling different voices in your head, that's a different problem, and we'll save that for kind of a different sermon. Okay, but you will hear many opinions from people all around you. You'll hear family, friends, leaders in the community, your neighbors, even strangers. Everybody's got an opinion about what you should do. And in those moments, you might ask yourself, who should I believe? Who should I believe? And when people of this world are trying to get you to listen to their version of what's happening in life, you should ask, you need to ask, who should I believe? And so today we will see just such a day in the life of Jesus. Now, there's an endless amount we can learn from Jesus' life, from his teaching, from his miracles. No moment, no word of Jesus is unpacked or unfull of meaning. There's always more to learn from him, and we'll never get it all. So in the 5th chapter of Mark, we're going to see a story of a couple people who came to Jesus for help. And let's just see some of the lessons we can learn from this encounter. This is Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 21. When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. Now, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, "If I just touch his clothes, I'll be made well." Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he was looking around to see the one who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" When Jesus heard what was said, he told the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James' brother. They came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this, they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So in this passage, Jesus does two famous miracles. It's actually kind of, we get a twofer in this passage. And life with Jesus would have been interesting because you never knew what was going to happen. Can you imagine being one of his disciples walking around? You never knew what was coming next. And people will often ask, it's kind of been a popular thing, what would Jesus do? But I find in the Bible, even those closest to him had no clue what he was going to do. They didn't know what was coming next. And so I'm a little suspicious of that question, because what makes us think we would know what Jesus would do? Any better than that? I mean, if Peter and James and John, who were with Jesus, didn't know, why would we? Now, perhaps a better question for us to ask is, what did Jesus say? What did he tell us to do? Are we doing what he said? Not what you think he would do, but what he told you to do. Or are we listening to the many voices around us who would like to tell us what they think Jesus would do? We need to be careful about that. Now, in this story, Jesus had got off the boat from crossing the Sea of Galilee. It didn't take long for word to get out that Jesus was back. He's back in town, and the whole crowd gathered to come and see him there by the sea. They were waiting to hear him. They wanted to hear his teaching. They wanted to see his great miracles. Jesus was a sight to behold, and the crowds thronged him. And while massive amounts of people were crowding around to see Jesus, a probably unexpected person came to Jesus. And that's because he needed Jesus' help. This man, his daughter was dying, and he knew Jesus was the one who could help him. So he came. And let's pick back up in the story. Let's go back to verse 22 of Mark chapter 5. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, "My little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she can get well and live." So Jesus went with him, and the large crowd was following and pressing against him. Now, this is an interesting moment because we kind of, as we read through the Bible, we find most synagogue leaders weren't usually so friendly to Jesus. I mean, he wasn't necessarily popular with all of the Jewish rulers. But here we have Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, throwing himself at Jesus' feet, begging Jesus for help. And this is really simple, I think. Jairus knew who had the power to help his daughter. He had seen Jesus' miracles. He knew Jesus can make a real difference in his daughter's life. And Jairus has hit a situation where he doesn't really care what anyone thinks. He wants his daughter made well. She's on her deathbed, his 12-year-old daughter. And sometimes a father must swallow his pride to do what's necessary for his children. That day comes. I think we see that here in Jairus. Jairus needed help, and he knew Jesus could do it. And this is the place each of us need to come to, where we see the true desperation of our situation, and we recognize Jesus is the only one that can help. He's the one we need to go to. He's the one we need to call out to. He's the one who can truly help our situation and work in our circumstances. And God will allow your circumstances to bring you to this point where you don't care what anyone thinks, you just want his help. God will do that in your life. Are you there? Are you ready to cast aside public opinion in order to have God's work done in your life? Are you hungry enough to have his work in your life so that you don't even care what anyone thinks? Are you ready to stop caring what people think as long as Jesus makes it right? And you're going to put your faith in him. See, the sooner you get to that point, the sooner you will see God's power at work in your life. The people who came to Jesus, who cast aside what the public opinion was, who came to Jesus, they saw God's power at work in their life. Now, an interesting dynamic that we see in Jesus is that he always helped anyone who came to him for help, no matter who they were. You never see Jesus turning anyone away. Whether they were rich or poor, whether they were powerful or weak, whether they were influential or unknown, Jesus helped anyone who came to him and said, "Master, help me. Jesus, I need your help." If they came to him asking for help, he helped. And this is good news for us because anyone who genuinely believes, who genuinely comes to Jesus for help, he will be there to help them. He will. He welcomes anyone who will come to him. He never casts them out. Hearing Jairus' request, the synagogue ruler's request, Jesus immediately went with him. He was already busy. He had a whole crowd of people to tend to, but this person came and asked for his help, so he immediately goes with him. And the crowds of people are going along as well, eager to see what Jesus would do next, wanting to touch him. I mean, if you can think of the most famous person in the world, how the crowds gather around and wanting to touch him, wanting to shake his hand, that's what Jesus would have been like. He was the most influential person they had ever seen. However, while they're on their way to Jairus' house, another person came needing help, a very different person. Let's look again at verses 25 through 29. Now, a woman suffering from bleeding for 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She had spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothing. For she said, if I just touch his clothes, I will be made well. Instantly, her flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was healed of her affliction. This woman had endured bleeding, a bleeding problem, for 12 years. Most likely a female problem that she had. Now, this not only would have caused her to be chronically anemic, but in their society, she would have also been made unclean. She would have been unclean. That means because she was bleeding, as long as she was bleeding, she would not have been allowed to touch anyone or anything in public. She would not have been allowed to go to worship or to visit the temple, to offer sacrifices. She was unclean. And this physical problem would have made her a social outcast. On top of that, she had spent everything she had on doctors, and none of them were able to help her. Now, maybe some of you can relate this morning. Maybe you have gone to doctor after doctor, and you have paid for prescription after prescription, and you're still not well. Okay, that's where this woman was. Mankind's ability to fix her problem had failed. They took all her money, but they left her body bleeding and left her poor, a poor outcast of society. The doctors told this woman she was a hopeless case. The bank told her she was bankrupt. The world told her it's never going to get any better. But then there was Jesus. And Jesus was doing impossible things right there where she lived. Who would she believe? Would she believe the voices of the world? Or would she believe the hope that could be found in Jesus? She chose to believe in Jesus. She said, if I could just touch his clothes, I'll be made well. And she set out to do exactly that. She worked her way through the crowd that she wasn't supposed to be in, that she wasn't supposed to touch. And she had the faith to believe that if she could just get to Jesus, if she could just have the slightest touch, even of his clothes, he could make her whole again. But see, it was against the law. It was against the law for her to touch Jesus. It was against the law for her to touch his clothes because of her bleeding. It was against the law for her to be in that crowd. She was unclean and required not to touch anyone. But you know what I find interesting? She didn't listen to the rules. Instead, she chose to believe in Jesus. She chose to risk everything to get to him. And as a result, she was healed. It is kind of an interesting dynamic. Every unclean person that was not supposed to be touched, the minute they came into contact with Jesus, he made them clean. You see that throughout the Gospels. This woman did get to Jesus. She was healed, but she did not get away unnoticed. So she tried to sneak up to Jesus in the crowd so she could be healed without anyone knowing it. She believed in him, but she had broken the law, and she didn't want anyone to know. But instead, this happened. Beginning in verse 30 of Mark 5, immediately Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" but he was looking around to see who had done this. The woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. "Daughter," he said to her, "your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be healed from your affliction." Jesus knew that the power had gone out of him to heal this woman, which in itself is an interesting dynamic. You didn't get accidentally healed by Jesus. He knew when his power was at work in your life. But perhaps more importantly, he knew the spiritual and emotional damage that this infirmity had caused in this woman's life. Jesus wanted to heal her body and soul. He wanted to make sure this woman knew God cared for her situation and had responded to her faith. This isn't something that happened by accident that she could sneak, but it's something God did in her life. And so Jesus makes a point of making sure she knew he knew. He was aware what had happened. He said, "Who has touched my clothes?" Well, that's exactly what she planned. If I can just touch his clothes. So when she did, he asked, who was it that did it? The disciples around him thought this was a crazy question. I mean, everybody's pressing in on you. Everybody's trying to touch you. You see the crowds pressing against you, and you're asking, who touched me? I don't know if you've ever tried to get through a crowd like at the fair when there's a million people. You get bumped. Well, Jesus is asking this question in this crowd. And we see the disciples, Jesus' closest followers, questioning what the master is saying. Does Jesus know what he's talking about? How could you ask such a question? Weren't circumstances obvious that everybody's touching you? But see, Jesus knew what he was saying. And this put the woman in an interesting situation. She had to decide which voice she would listen to. Who would she believe? Would she believe Jesus, who's saying, I know what you've done, even when no one else knows? Or would she listen to the disciples and think, well, I got away with it because everybody's touching him? Who would she believe? Well, Jesus didn't ask this question to shame the woman. He asked this question because he wanted to make her able to go in peace, to know that her faith in him had made a difference in her life. The woman believed Jesus. She believed enough to come and touch him that she would be healed. She believed that. But she also believed Jesus enough to respond to his words when he said, who touched me? She believed he knew, even when everyone else did not. She believed his words over any other voice of objection and even over her own fears. In fact, she fell down before him with fear and trembling and told him the whole truth. As a result, Jesus did not shame her. He did not criticize her for breaking the law, but instead he sent her away in peace, praising her faith because she believed in Jesus. An interesting detail that we don't always notice in this story is that the daughter of Jairus was 12 years old. And the woman had suffered from an infirmity of bleeding for 12 years. Matches. Also, Jesus calls this woman that he healed daughter. You don't see Jesus using that directly to a person very often. He calls her daughter in the middle of the story about Jairus wanting his daughter healed. You might say this is the story of two daughters encountering Christ on the 12th year leading up to their story. Two daughters, both on the same appointment time on God's clock. See, God always works in your life but it may take time. You don't always get what you want instantly. Okay, anybody relate to that? God's clock may seem really long to you. Sometimes He'll allow a temporary affliction so that you can learn to come to Him in faith. And these moments may seem long to us now, but they will seem small in the light of eternity. In fact, Paul put it this way. This is 2 Corinthians 4:17. For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. Maybe you're there this morning experiencing affliction, problems, pain, difficulties. And maybe the world says it's just never going to get better. It's just the way it is. Things that people will tell you, they'll tell you it's just gone too far to be fixed. There's no hope. But what we see in God's Word, what we see is that Jesus welcomes everyone who comes to Him, and that God has a plan for every purpose, for every person, but that we must become a part of that plan by faith. See, in both instances, both with Jairus and with this woman, they had to come to Jesus in faith to receive God's plan working in their life. Do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in Him more than the voices of the world? The voices that are telling you there's no hope. Do you believe what Jesus says more than the people talking around you? Do you believe in Jesus more than you believe even your own fears and anxieties? This woman did. And she received her healing. This is what it takes to experience His power at work in your life. The woman believed Jesus, and as a result, she experienced God's power and was sent away in peace. Now, as you may recall, this miracle with the woman is kind of a detour. Okay, it's an event within an event, because it's an interruption, because Jesus was already on an errand on His way to Jairus' house. Remember, the synagogue ruler, he had come and he had said, please come heal my daughter. And Jairus wanted him to come because his daughter was dying. And this was an urgent errand. His daughter wasn't just a little sick, she was dying. Every minute could be a matter of life and death. First, the crowd was getting in the way. They were pressing on Jesus. I'm sure that slowed him down, the process of getting to Jairus' house. And now Jesus is distracted by healing this woman. I'm sure you can imagine how Jairus felt, a father seeking help for his only child, wanting that help to come now, fearing every minute could be 1 minute too long. But Jesus wasn't in a hurry. He knew exactly what He was doing and exactly what He was going to do. See, understand, God is never surprised. There's never going to be an event in your life where God is going to say, oh, I didn't know that was happening. He's not surprised. He's not caught off guard. He never needs to be rushed. God is always perfectly on time for His plan. You just have to wait for it. But while Jairus was waiting on Jesus to deal with this other woman that Jesus called daughter, Jairus' worst fear for his own daughter came upon him. Look at verse 35. While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house and said, your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? When Jesus overheard what was said, He told the synagogue leader, don't be afraid, only believe. See, Jairus' friends and family were saying, it's over. Don't look to Jesus for any more help. This situation has gone too far, even for him. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. But Jesus said, don't be afraid, only believe. Have faith. This is the same dynamic we face. There will always be people in the world who are telling you to give up. Okay, you're going to run into it everywhere. They'll tell you it's hopeless. They'll tell you God will never do anything here. They'll tell you God will never do anything in your life. You're too old. You're too young. You're too whatever. They will always have an excuse of why God can't. But Jesus commands his followers, don't be afraid, only believe. We are called over and over in Scripture to fear not and have faith. That is what God wants from us. Don't allow your fears and your anxieties to dictate your life, but put your faith in Jesus and let him guide you through what may come. See, who will you believe? Will you believe the voices of the world? Or will you believe the words of Jesus? Well, who did Jairus believe? I'm happy to say he believed Jesus. He believed Jesus. And let's continue with that story, verse 37. Speaking of Jesus, he did not let anyone accompany him except Peter, James, and John, James' brother. They came to the leader's house, and he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? This child is not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, but he put them all outside. He took the child's father, mother, and those who were with him, that would be the 3 disciples, and entered the place where the child was. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which is translated, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years old. At this, they were utterly astounded. Then he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Because Jairus listened to Jesus, because he put his faith in Jesus and believed in Jesus, Jairus saw his daughter raised from the dead. Jesus made a difference in his life. Faith made a difference in his life. Who will you believe enough to trust with your life? Enough to trust with your family? Enough to trust with your future? See, the choice you make will determine your future. Once Jesus had healed the woman with the bleeding problem and he had the crowds and most of the disciples stay behind. My guess is that the disciples stayed behind as crowd control. They had to keep the other people there, because they wanted to follow Jesus and hold them back. But Jesus took Peter, James, and John. We see that formula kind of playing out in different scenarios. And he went on with Jairus to his house. And they got there, and the funeral proceedings were already starting. Okay? Everything there was getting going. And we tend to approach funerals a little differently in our society than they did. We have a little better ability to preserve the body, so we're not in as much of a hurry. Most ancient cultures, when someone died, you buried them right away. Okay, that day. It's you don't send invites for people and have them come a month later. You bury. And in part, I think we have some different concepts about it, partly because of that dynamic, partly because we have 2,000 years of Christian theology that has shaped our concept of heaven. Okay, we have a lot of different concept of heaven than most of the ancient world, or even than the Old Testament people would have had, because God has revealed in the New Testament more details that they didn't necessarily have. But what I encounter in our culture is no matter who they are, everyone seems to think their loved one has gone to a better place. Okay, every funeral you do, their loved one's in heaven. That's what they always assume. The unfortunate truth is that is not true. It's not true. So yes, there is a heaven. It's a real place. There's a real heaven. But there is also a real hell. That is also a real place. And most people, all those who are without Christ, go to hell. That's reality. So most funerals know they're not in a better place. But I think that concept of heaven has changed, it shifted our cultural response to death. I also suspect that we react differently to death because we leave the dirty work of dealing with death to the professionals. Okay, this I think has changed it. When's the last time you had to go through the ordeal of firing up the barbecue to do an at-home cremation? That would take a lot of charcoal. It's not easy to burn up a body. Okay. I believe it or not, I was the one time I actually went to the ER for me. I was there, and it turned out I had a torn muscle, and it was pretty painful. But I was there, and what they had playing all night, over and over, was a documentary on the TV. They had a documentary on death and how they deal with the bodies. That's not good viewing in an ER. Okay, just to let you know. Not the best plan. But in our society, we don't let you take care of those things yourself. You have to have a licensed professional deal with it, and someone that has, but I think that's created a distancing from death for our society. We distance ourselves from the realities of death as much as we can. But back in Jesus' day, when you had a relative die, you had to prepare the body at home. In fact, it was that way even 100 years ago here. It wasn't that far off. You had to prepare most of it yourself, and it was a fairly traumatic experience, and they would actually have people weep and wail, sometimes professionally. They had professional funeral goers who would weep and wail when someone had died, and that way you ensured your loved one was properly mourned over. Okay? We buy flowers, they paid people to cry. Same. So I know it's a different concept, but it's the same thing. Jesus arrived as they were already mourning the death of this little girl. And he kicks everyone out of the house. I'm going to tell you right now, you invite Jesus to a funeral, he will ruin the funeral. Every funeral he went to, he ruined it. Okay, just make a note of that. But he kicks everyone out of the house except for the 3 disciples and the parents of the little girl. Are you okay with Jesus kicking people out of your house? Apparently Jairus was. His level of faith, his level of, I don't care what anyone thinks, I want Jesus in my situation, had reached the point he didn't care if Jesus kicked the whole town out. He wanted Jesus to save his daughter. And at that moment, that was what he was interested in. He was more interested in what Jesus said, what Jesus wanted, what Jesus did, than what anybody thought about it. See, the voices of those around him said, you should mourn. And they laughed at Jesus. They laughed at anyone who said otherwise. But what Jesus said to Jairus is, you must believe. Who did Jairus believe? Well, he put his faith in Jesus. And it paid off. It paid off big time. In fact, Jesus went in. He took the little girl by the hand and said, little girl, get up. What's interesting is she did get up. When Jesus told someone, get up, they got up. And then he told them to get her something to eat. I like this about Jesus. He understood people needed to eat. Okay? I mean, it's one thing I like him. He was always feeding people. It's a good thing about Jesus. Now, this was the first time recorded where Jesus raised someone from the dead. It's not the last time. This is the first time. In fact, kind of an interesting dynamic. This time, he raises the little girl from the dead in her home. She's just barely, she's not even cold yet, but he raises her from the dead. The next time, he waits till they're actually carrying the coffin out. And he raises her from the dead there. The next time, he waits till they've been buried for 4 days. With each one, he's leaving less and less room for question. He's really raising people from the dead. So just a little note on resurrections that Jesus did. The people were all amazed. This girl had died, and now Jesus just raised her back to life. They are amazed at what Jesus has done. He can do anything. He has power over even life and death. Who did Jairus believe in? He believed Jesus. And the result was he saw God's power at work in his life. What if Jairus had believed the people? The people who said to him, your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? What if he had believed them? What if Jairus had believed his own fears or worried about what people might think? Then he would have missed out on God doing this great work in his life, this great work in his family. And so I think the question for us this morning is, who will you believe? There are many voices in the world calling out to you, giving you information, giving you opinions, but who will you believe? Will you believe the voices of the world that tell you it's over? The voices that tell you all hope is gone? The voices that tell you God can't do that here? Will you believe the voices that say, don't trouble with Jesus anymore? Or will you believe Jesus? Jesus who said, have faith. Jesus who said, don't be afraid, but believe. Will you put your faith in Him, knowing that no matter what has happened, no matter what you face in life, He has the power to make things right in God's time and God's way? See, today the choice is yours. You have to choose who you will believe in. I hope and pray, like Jairus and like this woman, you will choose to believe Jesus and receive the reward of your faith.